You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on the Old Testament historical books. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders, and I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner. He's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
Before that, we were going to talk about this picture. Is that all right?
Okay, let's talk about the picture first. Right. Yeah. And for people listening, I'll describe it. Can I describe it?
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a battle going on. I see some walls and some ladders. There are people on top of the wall that look like they have, I think they have little shields. It kind of looks like maybe they're throwing slings. Slings. I think they're slinging down rocks. And the people on the ground have amazing looking shields. They look kind of like shark fins, or kind of like if you turned a boat, like a rowboat up on its side. Yeah. There's kind of a point at the top, and it looks kind of like a shell. Yeah. What's going on here?
Remember in Joshua, we talked about how they came in and did the battles, and they had the major battle through the middle, and then they went down to the southern area and then up to the north. Yeah. Judges is going to talk about now them each individual tribe going in and conquering the land that Joshua gave them. So that's why the Judges, it might look like there's a contrast between Joshua and Judges, because Joshua says at the end, like in chapter 24, it says, and God gave them all the land that he had promised to them. But then you get into Judges and it says there's a whole bunch of land they still haven't conquered. So the idea is now, so we still have a picture of a battle here, but now the tribes are supposed to go in and conquer the land that they had already been given by Joshua. And that's the problem. Remember, I talked to you guys last week about if they'd have come in right away, it probably wouldn't have been such a problem. But because they probably waited a little too long, what was happening is the Canaanites came back into the land, and now they're a big problem again.
Right.
So, but this picture is actually brilliant. I never even thought about using ladders to get up on the wall. I'd hate to be the first one going up that ladder, wouldn't you? I've also seen a picture of people using their shields to make like a platform. So there's so there'd be like a multiple levels of people stacking themselves up so they get high enough to get into that. So that would be like at night, you'd have to worry about those guys using their shields to make multiple levels, and then they'd climb to the top and get right over the wall. So that's another thing that could be used in war. Your shields that you were talking about, in one sense, they're kind of brilliant because what they do is they protect the whole soldier. Now remember, the soldier, for him to fight well, he's going to have to step out around and shoot his, fling his rock or his sling out the side. So if you've got a shield that comes over the top, that can actually be really helpful when you're doing this kind of battle anyway. So I thought that picture really helps us to understand. Last time, remember, we talked about the gates and how they have to be protected and that. Now you're seeing more of what the battle actually looked like.
Right.
Yeah.
Pretty brutal.
Okay. All right. So then the Hebrew word of the day, whoops, we went right past it. All right. This one's actually kind of fun. Okay. It's in Judges 1, 6 and 7. And it says, Adonai Bezek, okay, he's the king. He's one of the kings. Okay, fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toe. Well, in Hebrew, the word for a thumb and a big toe is the same. So in the Hebrew, it actually has, it has this word bahonoth, and it means toes, or it can mean thumbs. So it's a word that can be used multiple. It depends what the word behind it is. So this one has the thumbs of the hand and the feet. So it's the same word, but you got to realize it's not the same thing. So this is funny. They only had one word that covered both big thumbs and big toes. And that's kind of funny because they have like 5 or 6 words for locusts, different kinds of locusts. In Joel, it's got like 4 different words for locusts. But I think that's giving you a mindset. It's letting you know that for them, locusts were something that was really important for them. So they had multiple names for them.
Oh yeah,
where a thumb and a big toe are not really that important. So you've got the same word that covers them both.
And that's still like the thumb, they would still recognize as separate from your fingers? Would there
Yes,
be a word for
yes, there is a word
fingers?
for fingers.
Or
So they do have a
wow, interesting.
different, but the big thumb and the big toe are pretty much the same.
Yeah, I guess a thumb kinda looks like
there,
a
there you
toe,
go.
yeah.
Okay. Now, one other thing I wanted to tell you is in this verse, it talks about
Mm.
that they cut off his thumb and his big toe, his thumbs and his big toes. Now that sounds really cruel. And then he responds, which sounds really weird. Adonai Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their toes were cut off, used to gather scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. So it sounds like he used to do that to others, and then he's getting it done to him. But even more important, why would you
Oh,
cut off
man.
their thumbs and their big toes? And my response to that is that made them almost impossible to use a bow, right? And it almost made them
Yeah,
so that they couldn't be like a warrior. Your toe actually helps you balance. So what's going on here is they're not
sure, yeah.
they're no longer able to balance themselves, and so they're not a real danger anymore. So I just thought that was
Yeah, their ability to fight is
yeah.
really
So I think
yeah.
it's funny that that's what's going on here, and it actually gives us some logic of what's going how they think about things. Okay, and
Yeah,
I think the first time I read
yeah.
that I had no idea why they'd cut off their thumbs and toes, but after you think about it, why it does make sense. So
I suppose it's nicer than killing them, I
yeah,
mean
yeah, you made it. You remember last week we talked about them cutting the hamstrings of the horses, and that made them so
oh,
that they
right,
couldn't pull
right.
chariots anymore.
Couldn't run as
Yeah, so
hard,
that's
yeah.
kind of
Oh, right, pull
and
chariots,
that's
right, right.
kind of the same thing as what we've got here. They've made them
Yeah,
so that they're not going to be a threat anymore, basically.
yeah,
Okay, so that's my
yeah.
Hebrew word for today:
Okay,
your thumbs and big toes.
that's a good one. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, all right, let's go to the next. And the next one is my big outline of the book. And so what we've got there is there's actually three parts. And I put those numbers on here so that you actually see what they are. So the first part of the book is them talking about incomplete settlement of the land of Canaan. So verses chapter 1
Yeah,
through 2:5 is talking about that. Then this whole second section is talking about each of the judges and what was happening during their time. And then at the end, you've got what I call appendices. And basically, you've got this story about
mhm,
Micah and the Danite migration. That's the first one in 17 and 18. Then you've got the Gibeonites, I call it the abominable deed, and Benjamin's punishment. So those two sections are
right.
at the end of the book, and we'll talk about that. But right now, I'll give you a little hint. I actually think that's to give you a clue as to what that time period was like. Do you remember?
Hmm,
We've got basically the key phrase for the time of the judges is that people did what was right in their own eyes. They didn't have a king. There was no king in Israel,
right,
so they did what was right in their own eyes. These two appendices
yeah,
basically show you they're basically doing what's right in their own eyes and not caring about anybody else. So
right.
I think
Yeah,
that's really important. Now I have no idea when those two issues took place. I don't think they're in
mhm,
chronological order or anything like that. But what they are is to give you a picture of what the time is like. So I think it's kind of neat.
yeah.
Then
Yeah,
you've
that
got
is, yeah.
my picture here is of a spiral going down, and there's basically a couple parts to this spiral. You've got the deliverance. First it starts
Mhm,
with apostasy. The people wander away from God. Then God
right,
sends them into
right.
servitude. They then call out to God, and God then brings a deliverer. In judges, we often think
Mhm,
of a judge as a person that judges, law cases and stuff like that. And apparently they did do that. But in this book, it's much broader than that. It means somebody that's sent as a deliverer, somebody who's going to, and we're going to see that in a minute. The
mm,
text will actually tell us that. So you've got that structure that's kind of interesting, and the word has a lot more broad meaning than you would think. And some of them don't
right,
even have
right.
a deliverance part. They just talk about them judging in the land. So it includes both those sections, and it kind of gives you some clue that the word is a lot broader than what we expect.
Yeah, sure, okay.
One other thing I wanted to show you, that there's a little timeline on my picture here, and the period of the judges is between the conquest and David. Basically, conquest is a major element, and the King David is. This period of the judges is right between those. Yeah. Okay, so that's the summary of the book anyway. All right, then.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, then we got the next one. I've got key ideas in the book of Judges, and first there's this. The first one is that cycle of judges. It's going to go through each of these judges, and there's 13 of them. It's going to go through each one of them and talk about what they did. Okay. Then you got God's justice and grace. The justice is he sent these nations against them to punish them. But then the grace is that God hears their call out to him, their supplication, and he sends a deliverer to help them. So you've got both aspects of it, his righteousness being upheld, but then also his grace coming in and protecting the people. So it's kind of neat again.
Yeah.
And then another one is God providing these deliverers, and that's real clear. Sure. And then you've got covenant failure of the people. That one's real clear because, in fact, especially in chapters 1 and 2, it talks about how they disobeyed God, and so God sent these nations against them. So it's real clear they're not following what God told them to do. Okay. And then there's one other element that I want to look at here, and it's the role of the Spirit of the Lord. It's not always what we think. And so I actually have a word study in here for us to see how they use that term. So I think that'll be fun for us. All right.
Yeah, that sounds good.
We're going to start in chapter 1. And basically in Joshua 21:43, it says, "So the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to them, their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it." Well, that makes it sound like it's over, right? But then the minute you get into Judges verse 3, it says, "Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, 'Come with me to the territory allotted me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I will go with you and your into the territory allotted to you.' So Simeon went with him." So basically, almost immediately, you've got, wait, they're still having to conquer land, even though you had this phrase in the last one that talked about them already getting it. So I think it's important for us to realize the difference between conquering the big picture, the whole thing of the land, and then going in and having to take each part of the land. And that's kind of the way wars work, isn't it? So
Well, yeah, and I mean they're going to have to continue to fight to maintain it even after this.
So anyway, so that's going to be helpful for us. All right. Then, so we just talked about Joshua and Judges, Judah and Simeon, how they work together. Then Jerusalem in Judges 1:8 says, "Then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire." Now, remember, before only 3 cities got burned, right? This time, now they did it again. Right. So this is when they're coming back into it to reconquer it. Now, what's funny is just a few verses later, it's going to say that they lost it again, and then the Canaanites lived in there, the Jebusites lived in there until this day. So obviously, it was going back and forth and back and forth, and there's a lot more complicated explanation than just, they conquered the land and then they owned it. That's not really the way it happened.
Right.
All right. Then we've got the Negev in Judges 1:9, where it says, "Afterwards the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in the Negev and in the lowland." So we've got them now again sounding like they have to take this land again. All right. Now, in verses 12 and 13, we've got Caleb. Remember, Caleb was the one that had gone into the land, and he saw, he came back and said, "Oh, yeah, we can take it if God gives it." Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So verse 12 says, "And Caleb said, 'The one who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him my daughter, Exika, for a wife.' Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, so he gave him his daughter Azisa for a wife." So here my map is. You've got this picture of Judah down here, this area, but Debir was a city within there that still needed to be conquered, and so obviously, apparently, Othniel did that. So it's kind of fun. You actually see the 2 parts of what the battle actually looked like. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Then verse 16 talks about the Kenites. Um, Remember, the Kenites were related to Jephthah, or not Jephthah, Moses' father-in-law. And yeah, it says that
Oh,
he was a
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Kenite. So
Yeah.
verse 16 says, then the descendants of Kenites, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms. And most people think that's Jericho. Remember,
Mm,
Jericho has a well, and it's in a desert area. So these palm trees would
mhm,
spring up, and it seems to be called the city of palms. All right, with the sons of Judah to
mhm,
the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad. So what I've done is tried to show you a picture of where Arad is. Arad is really far south in the land. So you can see the map here. So they went from Jericho
oh, yeah.
down to Arad. Okay, so that gives you some
Uh-huh.
clue as to where they were. Then we got Judah and Simeon. It says that they were successful in the next couple of verses because they take Zareph,
And helping
yeah,
each
and
other.
they take Zephathah,
Mhm,
Hormah, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron. These are, you can look at our map and we can actually see some of those. Verse 19 says, now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive the inhabitants out of the valley because they had iron chariots. Now that's kind of neat
mm,
because we know that what we call the Iron Age is from 1200 to 600 BC. So that actually helps us also kind of date when these judges were taking place, because otherwise you couldn't
yeah,
have iron before you had iron. So
right.
these chariots
Yeah,
must have been kind of a new weapon, and especially made out of iron, they'd be stronger than before.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
very strong.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next one. The next one is Benjamin in verse 21. And it says, the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Well, remember in verse 8, it had
Right.
already said they had captured Jerusalem. So it must be
Yeah,
going back and forth between these people. And now you see that
yeah.
Benjamin couldn't even actually take Jerusalem. And so now it seems like the Jebusites are
It's
there.
kinda
Yeah.
shared.
Now, remember,
Yeah.
Jerusalem is going to be the one that David takes for his capital. And it says at that
Oh,
point that the
sure.
Jebusites were living in it. So that does make
Yeah.
some sense as to what's coming later then too. Okay.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Verse 23 through 25 says, the house of Joseph spied out Bethel. Now, the name of the city was formerly Luz. The spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly. So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and his family go free. Now, I'm going, well, this sounds like a traitor, right? I mean, but in one sense,
Yeah.
it actually saved his life, but also they then conquered Bethel in an easier way than otherwise it would have taken quite. Bethel normally they'd
Sure,
have to
yeah.
surround it and probably wait for
Yeah,
some kind of
siege.
siege
Yeah.
warfare. Yeah. So anyway, so this actually saved Joseph the sons of Joseph for having a long drawn out battle.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think I'd want to be that guy that was a traitor.
No.
All right.
Right.
Next, it talks about Manasseh in verse 27. But Manasseh did not take
Okay.
possession of Bashan and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, and the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, and the inhabitants of Eblim and its cities, and the inhabitants of Megiddo and all its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. Man, so when you look at it,
Wow.
that's a pretty major part. Those are all really big cities, and it's a pretty major part of that
Yeah.
area that Manasseh should have had. Remember, Manasseh is going to
Right.
be when half tribe of Manasseh is going to live on the Trans-Jordan side, on the other side, and now you can see
Mm.
why the land that they were given, most of the land they couldn't conquer anyway. Yeah. So,
Right.
doesn't it
Wow.
sound like it's such a contrast? We saw Joshua, which said God gave him all the land, and now we've got all these verses that talk about land that hadn't been taken yet. So, yeah,
Right. Some of it's complicated and has to be won, and some of it doesn't they can't
yeah,
do it.
yeah.
That's pretty
Yeah. And
bizarre.
then Ephraim is talked about in verse 29.
Okay.
Ephraim did not drive out the
Mhm.
Canaanites who were living in Gaza, so that the Canaanites lived in Gaza among them. Then Zebulun in verse 30. Zebulun could not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahanol, or the Canaanites lived among them and came subject to forced labor. So, and I've got on a map here at least where Gazer is. But what you see is now we've got a whole chapter basically explaining that they couldn't take the land. We're not done.
Yeah.
Asher, a similar thing is said about them. The phrase that keeps coming up, like in this one, verse 32, so the Asherites lived among the Canaanites. They could not drive them out. And then Naphtali in the verse 33, they lived among the Canaanites. So see, it sounded initially like, oh man, it was easy. They took the land and that was it. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. And we're seeing that from this verse. It's talked about Dan then in verses 35 and 36, or I'm sorry, 34 and 35. It says the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they could not, they did not allow them into the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres and Ajalon and Serabeim. But the power of the house of Joseph grew strong. They put them to forced labor, but it sounds like the rest of the time they didn't. Now, remember, Dan is another one that their tribe moved. And the logic is the land that they'd been given, obviously they didn't take it.
Yeah, they couldn't take it.
So the logic is that had they done it initially, I think it would have been easy, and I think they would have done it. But I think they waited, and they didn't get the other tribes to help them, where Judah and Simeon worked together, and they got their land, and where it seems like the others didn't.
Yeah.
So does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, number
it's a bit tragic.
It sure is. Chapter 2 is verses 1 through 5 is real clear about how the Israelites were not obeying God. Here, and Judges 2, 1 and 2, it says, now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you to the land that I've sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. Now here's the key verse. But you have not obeyed me. This is what you have done. Okay, and then the next verse actually tells more specifically what they've done. Therefore I said to them, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and your gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named the place Bochum, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. Word Bochum means weeping. So the place name took on that name probably after this event happened there.
Yeah.
But it's pretty clear, right? If the Israelites would have obeyed God and kicked the people out of the land, and then stayed clean to God and continued to obey Him, they would have been fine. What happens is the people become a snare in their sides. They start going after their gods. God demands obedience here, and when they don't do it, they're gonna be punished for it.
Well, in that phrase you said, for maybe 2/3 of these examples is that they lived among the Canaanites. That implies that after they fought them, they made peace, right?
Yeah.
On some level, they figured out some way to live among them without fighting. I mean, is that what we're getting to here? These agreements?
I suppose, yeah. And one thing is really funny. Remember, it said in verse 2 that they were weeping after they heard this. If only instead of weeping, they would have actually obeyed. I think that would have been a lot more helpful. But they don't seem to do that. Yeah. So anyway, so that verses, I think those verses 1 through 5 are real clear how they didn't do what they were supposed to.
Yeah.
This next one shows 5 different reasons the Israelites failed in taking the land, and they're all from the biblical text. So it must be a mixture of all of these. First of all, it says the superior arms and fortifications of the Canaanites in chapter 1, verse 19. It says Israel's disposition to make alliances with people of the land in chapter 2, 1 through 5. And then Israel's sin must be punished in chapter 2, verses 20 and 21. And in chapter 2, 22 and 23, it actually says that God was testing to see if Israel would be faithful or not. So that seems to be another reason they were there. And then the fifth one is that Israel needed to be instructed in the art of war.
Oh,
and
that's
that's in
interesting.
chapter 3. Yeah, that was, I think, is funny. Remember, they had come through the wilderness wanderings, and they hadn't, and then they conquered the land, but
Mm,
then the people were starting to die off, so that this new group of people did not know how to do
they didn't know
war.
how to fight.
Yeah, and so apparently they needed to be instructed in that, so they were being trained by that as God
Wow,
brings in these nations to punish them.
that's
So
interesting.
yeah, that one is one that's kind of funny, but that's another reason it says that God brought him in.
Yeah,
So oh well. Anyway, it is funny. All
yeah.
right. Now, in chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, it makes it real clear. I'm going to read verse 10. It says, all the generations that were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for them in Israel, when the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. So part of the logic is that here's a new generation who had forgotten what God had done for them. And remember,
Hmm.
the Israelites were supposed to always tell them about God
Right.
crossing, the Passover, and him
Sure.
killing
Yeah.
the firstborns of Egypt, and then going through the Red Sea and stuff like
Yeah. It's
that.
supposed to be built into their traditions, and
Yeah. So
they build
apparently,
memorials.
yeah, apparently they weren't doing that. So
Right.
now and I put here, it's a downward spiral. They're just getting
Uh,
wickeder and wickeder as they go.
right. Right.
And we'll see that at the end for sure. All right, here's the common structure. You've got apostasy, then servitude. God puts them in the servitude. Then they've got
Hmm.
supplication, and God delivers them. And then they go back into apostasy again. I call this a spiral, because the next time they come into an apostasy, it seems like they're worse off than they were before. They get even more wicked.
Right.
So it's a downward
It's not a
spiral, not
cycle.
just
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It's getting
yeah,
worse. Yeah.
yeah.
That makes sense.
All right. What I
That's a
want
good
to do
image.
is show you the images here, or the verses that actually
Yeah.
explain each of those sections. So the
Okay.
apostasy, 2:11 through 14 says, then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and they bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. I assume you know that Baal is the male counterpart to Yahweh. He's the male god, and he was the god of storms and rain
Right.
and that kind of stuff. And then Ashtaroth were the female aspect of that. They were the ones that was supposed to be the consort of Baal.
Mm,
So you had to, and a lot of this was a fertility kind of right. So you had a
sure.
male and a female kind of goddess, and god
Yeah.
and goddess.
Yeah.
Verse 14 says, then the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of the plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. So there's
Mm,
what the apostasy did. Because of that, it then drove them into being punished by God.
yeah.
Okay, the servitude, you already heard one of the verses,
Hmm.
but I'll repeat it here. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of the plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, and as the Lord had sworn to them, so they were severely distressed. Notice it says, as the Lord had sworn to them. Remember in Deuteronomy, right before they come into the land, they make this covenant with God, and they make it clear that if you disobey, you're going to be punished. And in
Yeah.
fact, I'll bring the nations against you, and I'll use them against you. And
Yeah.
and they all say, "Oh yeah, we'll obey," and all that. Well, not very long after that, they get into this land. The one generation dies off, and look
Yeah.
how low they've sunk.
Yeah.
It can happen so fast, apparently.
Well, and it happens repeatedly. I
Yeah.
mean, this is the pattern we see as we continue through the Old
Yep.
Testament.
Yeah. And then we got that supplication. They
Mhm.
called out to the Lord. That's usually what the phrase is. In this section here, it didn't actually have that, but
Mm.
in other places it talks about them calling out to the Lord, and then He would do it. And then salvation in verse 2:18 says, then the Lord raised up judges for them. The Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groanings because of those who oppressed and afflicted them.
Hmm.
So here's that picture of God having pity on his people, even though they're sinning and doing stuff that really is anathema to him. He
Yeah.
still is helping them, and he still has a mercy and grace for them.
Yeah.
So, a lot of times you would think that the book of Judges, when people go to that, they usually say, well, what kind of a God do they have? It certainly doesn't look like a merciful
Mm.
one. And yet he was actually
Yeah.
bringing those judges to help the people. And there's
Right.
when it talks about raising up judges, when we think of a judge, we don't think of a person that's going to deliver them, but that it was included in that word for judges in the Hebrew word. So just so you know, it's a lot broader than what we normally would think of.
Well, and part of their delivery is living rightly,
Yeah,
right? I mean, that they need to
yeah,
change. So, I mean, that does kind of it,
fit with
even
it.
though it's, yeah, those two things really fit together well,
Yeah,
the idea of a
good.
deliverer and a judge.
Yeah. In chapter 3, it talks about God testing the nations, or the nation of Israel, and he says that God is going to leave these nations in Israel to test them. And in verse 3, you've got the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites. Um,
Hmm.
you hear a lot about the Philistines and
Yeah,
Canaanites,
right.
right? I mean,
Right.
shoot, those words were common enemies of them. Then in
Yeah.
verse 5, it even adds more. It has the Canaanites and Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And
Hmm.
these are going to be smaller groups of different nations. Now, Jebusites, remember, they're pretty much stuck, apparently, around Jerusalem, because that's where you
Yeah.
hear about them. The Hittites are going to be further up north.
Hmm.
Canaanites will be more in the central area with the mountains area there, probably. So, verse 4 says, "And they were testing Israel for testing Israel to find out if they would obey the commands of the Lord, which He had commanded their fathers through Moses." So it makes it pretty clear. And then verse 6 says they intermarried with them and fell into idolatry.
Yep.
So they did. It was in there to test, but they didn't do very well at the test, I'm afraid.
Right. Right.
All right. My next slide has all the different judges. So basically, it's to show you just how many there were and who the oppressors were, and then where you can find them.
Hmm.
But I also wanted you to see that a lot of times it says that they have a period of rest. And so if you add up all the years that are talked about in Judges, it would be 410 years. But
Wow.
if remember when we looked at the timeline, there
Yeah.
isn't 410 years between 1400 and let's say Saul's time,
Right.
in the 1050. There's
Right.
just not that many years in there. So what's going on is that these have to be overlapping. And so
Mm.
I think what you're going to find is there could be a judge having a period of rest in one area, they're ruling and having a period of rest in one area, but they could have another judge who's going to battle and
Yeah.
not having a period of rest. So I think
Right.
that gives you some clues so that you can have this 410 years there.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
All right. This shows you the dating of it. If you've got the wilderness wanderings, and then you've got Joshua, who lasts about 16 years, then you've got
Hmm.
the period of Judges, and then Samuel, who's about 5 years, Saul, who's 40, David 40, and Solomon. If you have
Hmm.
all those in there, the period of Judges can only be about 335 years. That's what the early reckoning is. Remember, we talked about that using 1 Kings 6:1 to talk
Hmm.
about when they come into the land and stuff.
Right. Right.
So even given that early date time, there's only 335 years between those events. If you go the late date reckoning, that pushes the period of the judges down to about 164 years.
Wow.
Now, what's interesting about that is sometimes it says that after these judges, there's two of them that have a period of 80-year rest. Well, you've got
Wow. Yeah, that
so
would
you've
be
got
all of it
that
almost.
would be almost all of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't see how having it that late would work. Having such a late date of them
Yeah.
coming into the land, it would really
Yeah.
be hard. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's kind of what we've got there. All right. All right. Now we've got the judges. And what I tried to do is just give you a little about how it talks about the period of rest with them. So Othniel, it says, the land had rest for 40 years, and Othniel, the
Mm-hmm.
son of Kenanite, died. Ehud, it says, after he did what he did, the land was so undisturbed for 80 years. Then Deborah and Barak, the land was undisturbed for 40 years. Then Samson, so he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. See, that's already there. That's your whole time period, and
Oh, yeah.
doesn't even have the rest of the judges. So
Yeah.
I even though I do think they're overlapping, I still think you have to have the longer time period for judges because
Yeah.
of how many events and times have to occur in there. Okay.
Yeah.
What we were going to do is have a little break here and have a
Okay.
split now, because then we'll come back and we'll talk about each specific judge. Okay. Does that make
Okay.
sense? All
Yeah.
right. What did we learn in these first bunch of verses? Well, we certainly learned that even though judges talked about having all those, Joshua talking about God giving him the land. You get into
Yeah.
Judges and you see that a lot of the land had not been conquered yet. So
Right.
so what looks like a contradiction, it seems like to me, is quite clear. It was two parts to the conquest of the land. The first part was pretty clear. It was a big, destroying the major elements in the land. But then when they went in to conquer each part of it, they did a pretty poor job of conquering it. And the phrase that seems to be key is, and the Canaanites lived among them in that area.
Which we see in here too is kind of evidence of disobedience.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Which, the second part of the conquest really is marked by disobedience.
Yeah. And you remember that area, or that whole chapter too, that talks about them disobeying God, and then they start to weep. So they call it boking, but they didn't get any better at obeying God. It didn't seem like the weeping is nice, but unless it's accompanied with action, it doesn't seem to do much.
Right.
So that seems to be in my, and then the idea of a spiral down, having these judges that would come through, and then each time they just keep getting worse and worse and worse. We also learned a little about the dating, how there's 410 years between these, and it just won't fit into the time, even if we make it the longest possible when they went into the land. It still doesn't. It doesn't fit all that stuff into it. So they have to be overlapping to some extent.
Yeah, that's good. Let's pause here, and then next episode, let's pick up with an overview of each of the judges.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good to me too. Thank you.